of all, because I didn't want to repeat the same talk to the group. And also because, I don't know, especially in nowadays, in our era now of this pandemic and Donald Trump and all that stuff, we don't live in, we have this expression, la la land, and do you use it in English or in well? We don't live in la la land anymore. This is not a perfect world anymore. Things are happening, things are changing. Some processes are good, some processes aren't that good. And I'll try to give an overview of what's happened in Israel in the last decades, or since my previous wonderful talk about how wonderful Israel is. So I'll try to give a slightly more realistic description of what's going on in Israel. I assume that many of the processes I'll talk to you, they are mirrored in what's going on in Wales and the UK as well. So you'll surely identify some issues as relevant to you. So I hope it will be an interesting talk, and we can start with the presentation. It's showing all right on everyone's screens, yeah? Okay. Where am I? Okay. Yeah, so I think in everyone's perception, Israel is a wonderful, warm, sunny country with tons of birds. And when we think about birding in Israel, we think about big numbers of migrants everywhere, like flocks of tens of thousands of white storks flying over on migration and coming to land in the fields and fish ponds, and then taking off in these huge thermals again. Flocks of thousands of white-winged terns flying up the Red Sea against the backdrop of the Eilat Mountains, coming down to land in the salt pans of Eilat, coating the banks of the salt pans in black and white, those wonderful white-winged terns. And hundreds of bee-eaters exhausted after crossing the desert, stopping in every agricultural spot, trying to catch their breath and feed on a few bees before pushing on. And every bush in a desert wadi contains wonderful, sexy Sylvia warblers like subalpine and rupels and cypress and Asian desert warbler. Just the bush is ticking with Sylvia warblers. And it's, well, these things still happen in a way, maybe not as powerful as they used to, but still, still Israel is extremely important for bird migration. As you can see in this map, it illustrates the huge migration flyways that sort of funnel through Israel. Israel is the only land bridge between the Eurasian landmass and Africa. So bird populations that migrate between those areas, they tend not to fly over water bodies, and then they get funneled through Israel. And it's true, we can see that with tracks of tagged birds with transmitters, and we can see that they really follow those routes. Another reason why Israel is so good for birding is that over Israel's small area, Israel is the same area of Wales, more or less, so it's not big, but we have very, very diverse habitats from alpine Mount Hermon through Mediterranean climates, semi-desert and harsh desert, and each different habitat of the country holds a different species assemblage or bird communities, and it is wonderful to bird in Israel. Israel is still a wonderful place for birding. I enjoy it now. I hope that one day when the skies open again, you'll be able to visit Israel. However, stuff happening in Israel is not different to other parts of the world. And processes like climate change and habitat loss and illegal killing are affecting Israel, at least as some other parts of the world, and maybe in a way more than other parts of the world, because because Israel is like a bioindicator for what's going on in other places. Processes that are happening over huge areas in Europe and Asia, they're expressed in Israel in a very concentrated, very condensed way. So Israel is a great place to monitor changes in the breeding areas, in the winter areas, but we certainly see the effects of climate change, habitat loss, and illegal killing they're expressed very strongly in Israel. The main processes I will talk about, or I'll try to show some information, some data about that are being expressed in birds in Israel are shifting trends. So some populations are increasing, others are decreasing, others are remaining stable somehow. This applies both to our breeding birds, to our migrants, and to our winter visitors. Another pattern we're seeing is changes in migration patterns. So because of climate change mainly, and also some large-scale habitat or land use changes are important as well. Birds respond to those processes, and they just change their migration routes. So some birds show up here in bigger numbers, others show up in smaller numbers. So that's an interesting stuff. And of course, I think it's a natural process that happens anyway. Birds are mobile, they have wings, and they explore, and they colonize new regions. It can happen naturally, or it can happen as a result of human activity, and invasive species colonized Israel like other parts of the world as well. So I'll try to give a few examples of each of these main processes, and we'll end with some kind of an overview. So let's get going. So first of all, I'll start with our red list. So it's a red list of our breeding birds. It was recently updated in 2017. We have 213 breeding species, or species that breed regularly in Israel. And out of these, 65 are threatened by different levels of extinction. You can see the different categories here. Those who aren't familiar with abbreviations, so LC is least concern, near threatened, vulnerable, VU, EN is endangered, CR is critically endangered, RE is regionally extinct, NA is no data available, and DD is data deficient. So you can see the different distribution here. It's quite a significant proportion of our breeding species are threatened in this degree or another. I'll give a few examples to that. Two species that recently in the last 20 years stopped breeding in Israel are little ringed plover and Maculated lark, so representing habitat loss of different kinds. So little ringed plover used to breed in a few wetlands that don't exist anymore. And Maculated larks, they bred in some high peaks in the Golan Heights that are Again, their habitat has changed. They've been lost and they don't breed here anymore. So both of these they didn't have large populations in Israel, so that's quite a typical process for quite many species. Israel is at the limit of their breeding range, and it is not abnormal to have sort of fluctuations at the edge of the breeding range. Populations that are at the edge of the breeding range are more susceptible to extinction. Often they're small, and these are processes like that. Neither of these species are globally threatened, and they have huge breeding areas, and still you can get them in big numbers in different parts of the world, but those edge populations in Israel aren't doing well, or were not doing well. They're not doing well at all now. A bit earlier on, two vulture species that used to breed in Israel. When I was a kid, I was still lucky to see both as breeding in Israel, a breeding species in Israel, Leopardfaced Vulture. The last pair bred in Israel in 1987, 88. I remember as a kid when I was traveling down to Eilat, I used to see them out of the bus window, and a couple of birds roamed the Israel desert until the mid-90s, early 90s, and not anymore. Lammergeier bred again in the Judean desert and in the Negev until the early 90s, but not anymore. So both of these species are gone as breeders in Israel. And these two species, the Eurasian Griffon or Griffon Vulture and Golden Eagle, they're following the footsteps of those species that we saw before, and they're heading towards extinction. Rich Birch, I assume you remember your visits to Gamla in the 1980s and 1990s. Tens or hundreds of Eurasian Griffons would fly past the watch point there. That doesn't happen anymore. You can visit Gamla in the north of the country and not see a single vulture. Golden Eagles are doing very bad in Israel. We have less than 10 breeding pairs. Interestingly, they breed in the desert, and they're really not doing well. They're suffering from habitat degradation, so less natural food and electrocution and poisoning and some poaching. So they're really not doing well in Israel. Another example for one of our most endangered species is Arabian Warbler. It is specific to acacia scrubland along the Arava Valley. It's actually an endemic subspecies. So much of the Arava acacia scrub has been cut down, cultivated, and we've lost most of our Arabian warblers. Currently, we have something like 50 breeding pairs in the country, but their habitat is really not doing well. Their remaining habitat, so they're under serious threat in Israel. A different example is Nubian Hijar. Nubian Hijars are my babies. I did my MSc study on them. Back then when I started studying them, virtually nothing was known about their biology, ecology, conservation. They were regarded as critically endangered. And when I started studying them, I contributed to the knowledge, and we started finding them in more places. So they're specific to one kind of salt marsh, like inland salt marsh with tamarisk and swadia bushes, and much of this salt marsh was cut down for cultivation during the 70s and 80s and 90s. However, in recent decade, in a few places it's been restored. Some patches of salt marsh have been restored, regenerated, and we're getting Nubian Hijars in places where they were lost in the past. So they're showing a positive trend, not rapid, I would say, but there are positive signs, and as a result, they climbed up the ladder from critically endangered to vulnerable. They're still threatened in Israel, but they're doing slightly better nowadays compared to 20 years ago. One example for an exceptional colonist in Israel that arrived in Israel in natural circumstances and has made an incredible takeover of Israel. Blackwing Kite, I remember as a young birder, it was mega rare in Israel. I remember the first bird I managed to twitch in Israel. It took me 3 attempts until I managed to see it in the other side of the country in the Bet Shean Valley. And from 2009, they started occurring in an increasing rate. The first pair started breeding in Israel in 2011. And in those 10 years, they've probably become the commonest breeding raptor in Israel, commoner than common kestrel. Probably a couple of thousands of breeding pairs in Israel at the moment. This map that you see on the right, that's where we found, these are breeding records from the last few years. So they really breed around the country. They still don't breed in the harsh desert and in the tops of the mountains, but basically they're found almost everywhere in the country, and they're also very conspicuous. When you drive around, you see them on wires, on pylons. They're very, very common and quite an incredible success story for these beautiful birds. Two other recent discoveries that we had in Israel, pallid scopsowl and Egyptianiger. We didn't know that they were breeding in Israel until something like 6-7 years ago, 2015, 2016, we discovered that they're regular breeding birds in Israel. Pallid scopsowl, we don't know that for sure, but we guess they are fairly recent colonists. We have something like 300 breeding pairs along the Jordan Valley. Their breeding habitat is mature date palm plantations. And these date palm plantations, they're about 30 years old. So they became mature only in the last 10, 15 years. And we suspect that those scopsowl didn't breed in Israel before these date palm plantations have developed enough to host them. Egyptiannigers, it's a smaller population, maybe something like 20, 30 pairs around the Dead Sea, the northern Dead Sea region. They might have slipped under the radar. As you all must know, it's so easy to miss night birds and they're so understudied. So it is possible that they did breed there before and we missed that somehow, but now we've started a more intricate study of their biology and conservation. We know more about them. And yeah, they're quite, well, there is a small population, not huge, but they seem to be doing quite okay. Yeah, so that's good to have them as regular breeding birds in Israel. Two examples of rain changes within the country. Namakwa dove used to be a species really restricted to Eilat and to the southern Arava, the southern tip of the Rift Valley in the desert. And in the last 10, 15 years, they've expanded their range quite seriously. First of all the way up the Rift Valley, all the way to the Hula Valley. And then the recent decade or something, they sort of hopped out of the Rift Valley, and they're quite widespread now, almost around the country, pretty much everywhere in farmland, cultivated areas. They're doing quite well. Great Tit shows an opposite process or expansion from an opposite direction. So it's as you know, it's a European species basically, and they're very common in the Mediterranean half of Israel. Yeah, they're common city birds as well, but they were never present in the desert. And with development of towns and cities in the Negev, in the south of the country, in the desert, and developing gardens there and planted woodland groves and some cultivation. They've penetrated the desert. The first pioneer pair reached Eilat last year. They probably bred already this year. So they're expanding quite quickly. And species like jay, blackbird, Syrian woodpecker, they're all going through the same process of expanding their breeding range into the desert, sort of using the villages, towns, cities as stepping stones to penetrate deeper into the desert. Two species that are responding, they're not close to each other taxonomically, but they're showing, interestingly, they're showing similar responses in the last 15, 20 years. Are these two species, pale rockfinch or pale rock sparrow, hill sparrow, it has a few different names, and thick-billed lark. Both species were rare in Israel and basically didn't breed. Pale rockfinch always had a tiny breeding population on top of Mount Hermon in the north of the country, but it never bred anywhere else in the country. And thick-billed lark was a big, big rarity until the 2000s. And in 2000 and or 99 or 2000, we found the first breeding in Israel, a small scale breeding event. But in 2010, following an exceptional downpour in part of the Negev and Arava Valley in the desert, we had a huge, huge, huge breeding invasion. Tens of thousands of breeding pairs came to breed in the green desert in that year. This photograph is from spring 2010. You can see it holding caterpillars in its bill like a puffin, bringing back anchovies or sand eels to the nest. It was quite an amazing event, and since then, they've colonized Israel. We have permanent populations in Israel, sometimes thinner on the ground. Again, this year, seems that there are bigger numbers. Flocks of hundreds are seen in different parts of the Negev these days. So this species has really changed its status in Israel. Pale rockfinch, similar story. Again, the first indications of breeding in other parts of the country in the early 2000s. And since 2010, since that same exceptional downpour rain event in the desert, they started breeding regularly in some parts of the desert and in some parts of the semi-desert as well. And every year we have nice breeding populations in quite a few sites in Israel, and in some years more and some years less. But it's something that was unheard of until about 20 years. We think this is something to do with climate change. So climate change in Israel is expressed in a few different ways, but one expression of climate change in Israel is more and more extreme weather events. So when it's hot, it's seriously hot. For example, last late May. We had a huge heat wave in Israel. Temperatures up to 56 degrees in some parts of the desert. It was, as you say in the UK, it was bloody hot. And on the other hand, in winter, when some weather patterns, proper weather patterns develop and winter storms arrive in the desert, the energy in these storms is huge, and we get these incredible, massive storms in the desert in higher frequency than in the past. So the extremes are higher. When it's hot, it's extremely hot, and when it rains, it pours. And species like these are probably responding to that. We're doing some research on that, and it's a very interesting story. Dunn's lark, by the way, is similar, has a similar pattern, but in a smaller scale as well. A couple of examples of invasive species that are now common in Israel. So first of all, monk parakeet. It's common in the center of the country. It's not, geographically, it's not spreading very quickly in the country, but it's quite widespread. But in the center of the country, it's present in very, very high densities. Common myna, the first pairs escaped from a cage that was broken into in a zoo near Tel Aviv in 1999. So it was really a handful of birds that escaped from that cage back then. And nowadays we have common mynas in basically every square inch of the country. They're still pretty urban or suburban. They don't really penetrate into the natural habitats yet, but it seems to be happening. It's certainly too late for eradication, I'm afraid. The authorities that are responsible for controlling for invasive species were, well, like almost everywhere else in the world, they were too slow in their response, and they decided to respond when it was way too late. And nowadays, it's just a new component in our Avifauna everywhere, basically. There are common mynas in high densities as well. A few examples of migrants. So basically the TransSaharan summer visitors here in Israel, they're showing similar trends to what's happening in Western Europe. So in Western Europe, species like pied flycatcher and wood warbler, windchat aren't doing well. And it's similar for birds that spend the summer here, they breed here, and winter in Africa. So Kretschmar's bunting, rufous-tailed bush robin or rufous bush robin, black-eared wheatear is another example, black-headed bunting. They actually migrate to India. They're showing similar trends, not good trends. So these species are on our red list. We've lost them in some parts of the country. In other parts of the country, they're still present, but in lower densities. But they're showing certainly negative trends. Another example is turtle dove. So you know much better than me what's going on in the UK. So in the UK, the decline is quite dramatic. Similar story in Western Europe. In the Eastern Flyway, it seems that the decline is not, well, was not that rapid, but there are some recent indications that sadly we're catching up with the West European Flyway. Turtle doves breed in Israel. They're still quite common breeders, at least in some parts of the country. We certainly have lower densities in the Mediterranean climate, but in the south of the country, they're still quite common and widespread, urban, suburban, but we see a huge drop. You can even call it a crash in the numbers of migrants. I'll give you an example. So in the early 2000s, we did a few counts, migration counts, and we had some days with very serious movements of them in late August and early April. And we did some standardized counts for them. And we reached hourly, like average hourly counts of 12, 13,000 flying through in an hour. So really phenomenal numbers. And we repeated those counts in 2018 and 2019, and we reached something like 200 per hour. So a drop of 2 orders of magnitude. Still, on some days, in some places, you can get nice concentration of migrants, but it's a pale shadow of the numbers that we used to have until about 20 years ago. Yeah, so as you know, illegal killing is a big issue for these turtle doves. They're suffering from that, especially in the Middle East and around the Mediterranean. And I'm sure that they're suffering from other processes like habitat loss and degradation and climate change. But they seem to be in, at least the migratory population that passes through Israel seems to be in big trouble as well. Other examples of trans-Saharan migrants, European or Eurasian migrants that winter in Africa, they're not doing well as a general statement. They're not doing well either. Tree pipit numbers are much lower nowadays compared to the past. Common redstart, it's an interesting story actually. The Western subspecies, the European redstart, somehow seems to be doing all right, but the Balkan or Southeast European subspecies, the Ehrenberg's redstart, is declining quite fast. We're seeing smaller numbers of them nowadays. However, some groups seem to be doing okay. Raptors passing through Israel, their numbers are somehow keeping stable. Lesser spotted eagle is one example. Honey buzzard, the numbers are stable. Steppe buzzard, the numbers are stable. Yeah, I don't know why this group, different species come from different parts of the world and they have different biologies, but they seem to be doing quite all right. This is data from autumn counts that we did in Israel until a few years ago. You can see in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the effects of the Chernobyl disaster that wiped out a serious proportion of the world population. And then you can see a gradual climb in the 1990s and 2000s to similar numbers to what was there before the big decline. So they've recovered quite well and seem to be keeping their numbers. Sadly, we haven't been able to continue with these large counts, or we will try to reach complete counts as much as that is possible. And sadly, for many years, we were funded by the Israel Air Force. However, they have lost interest in our counts nowadays because they have better radar systems that make our real-time information redundant in a way. but we're hoping to resume our counts in recent years in other methods maybe, but we really need to continue monitoring them and other species as well. Some interesting stories happening in our ringing stations. So we have 2 ringing stations that have been doing long-term standardized ringing for quite many years now. The Jerusalem Bird Observatory from 2003, it's properly standardized. And in Eilat, they've had some issues with their protocols, but from 2014, they're properly standardized. And you can see here, like total numbers of birds in autumn. On the left, it's at the Jerusalem Bird Observatory, and they seem to be doing quite fine there. There is a very slight positive trend there. However, in Eilat, in autumn, Eilat in the south of the country, you can see a very distinct, significant decline in the numbers that stop over in Eilat. And it's interesting because in Jerusalem, possibly some of this increase can be attributed to a continuous improvement in the habitat there. Maybe some of you have visited the Jerusalem Bird Observatory. It's a wonderful place, and the habitat there is getting better and better, and it's attracting more and more birds. However, in Eilat, I know that some of you have visited the IBRCE. You know that they're investing much in the habitat there, and the habitat there is becoming better and better for migrants as well. Yet, the numbers are dropping there. So something is happening. Either populations are declining or populations are shifting. So either they're not migrating through Eilat or they're hopping over Eilat without stopping. We don't really know what's going on, which is a pity because we try to collect data. We have quite a lot of data that we collect and we try to standardize it. But we really don't know what's going on in our neighborhood. There's no other country of our neighbors that does any kind of monitoring. The nearest ring stations are in Greece and in Turkey, so quite far away. So we really need to have a better understanding of what's going on in our neighborhood. In spring, at the JBO, the Jerusalem Bird Observatory, you can see the numbers of BlackUp. BlackUp is the main species that's caught there in spring, sorry. And you can see that the overall trend, especially from when the data is properly standardized in 2003, is sort of stable, more or less. There seems to be a decline showing since 2013, more or less. Or if you, I think something could be happening there, but it seems to be sort of keeping its dominance and keeping its numbers somehow, BlackUp. I'll give a couple of examples for winter visitors now. So Black Kite, when I was a kid, it was an exclusive migrant. So we hardly had any black kites wintering in Israel. All the black kites that breed in Eurasia used to migrate through Israel and spend the winter in Africa. And in the last 2 decades, they've changed their migration patterns drastically. First of all, I think that their numbers have grown. Global numbers of black kites have increased considerably. And in recent decades, 2 decades, huge numbers. I'm talking about something like 150,000 black kites winter in Israel. Of course, concentrated around landfill sites. Um, you can see huge concentrations of tens of thousands at one site, and it's quite a powerful phenomena. And they just stop. Well, they still, I would say, half of them still migrate to Africa, and half of them stop to winter in Israel. Similar stories, Eurasian Crane. Again, when I was a kid, tiny numbers of cranes wintered in Israel, and they all went to winter in Africa, especially in the highlands of Ethiopia. And nowadays, the highlands of Ethiopia are seriously degraded. And with climate change, the winter in northern Israel has become really mild. There still is quite a lot of rain, but the temperatures aren't as cold as they used to be. And now something like 40,000 cranes winter in the Hula Valley, and quite a few thousands in other parts of the country as well. If any one of you had the chance to visit the Agamon Hula, the Hula Lake, it's quite a powerful experience to drive in a tractor that feeds them in winter to avoid the crane flocks to fly into cultivated areas and causing huge damage to crops. So it's quite a powerful experience to drive through these tens of thousands of cranes in the Hula Lake in winter. So that's another significant change. A group that's significantly declining in Israel is a group of species that come from steppe or farmland habitat in Eastern Europe, Western Asia. So Hen Harrier, Pallid Harrier, Stock Dove, a few other species that used to come to winter in Israel. They've declined dramatically. So Hen Harrier, I guess similar trend to what's happening in the UK and Western Europe. Serious declines in Israel of these wintering populations. Overall, I try to give sort of representative examples. I must say that we don't have data for all birds in Israel. We have good or better data for breeding species in Israel. We have good data for migrants that get ringed in ringing stations, but a bit less for other species. We still have quite serious data gaps, but it seems that this is more or less the overall picture. So some species are responding well to or adapting to what's going on and either increasing or keeping stability, but it seems like the negative trends are more prominent, more serious in Israel. And we're seeing more species declining, both breeding species and migrants as well. And as you know, I work for a conservation organization, and it's our mission to try to prevent declines and to maintain to keep the common birds common. And we are trying to do what we can. It's always not easy as an NGO, and in Israel is a small country with a huge human population, and the challenges that we're facing are quite extreme in some parts of the country, and we need to work hard to achieve positive conservation processes in Israel, but we're doing our best. We need to do better. We need to do better monitoring, and we need to work harder to protect our habitats, both for migrants and for our breeding birds. And it sometimes leads to interesting conflicts. What is more important? And cultivated field in the desert that hosts migrants. It's a stopover site for migrants, or maybe it's more important to keep this desert habitat for our desert breeding birds. There's some interesting processes there, or interesting conservation conflicts that we need to deal with. But basically, we need to work harder and better. We need to look at the threatened species and to try and address the threats there and to work on that. Illegal killing is one thing that we're looking at. In Israel, we have a huge campaign to start to cancel recreational hunting in Israel. Hunting is not a big issue in Israel, especially not illegal hunting, but there is still hunting in Israel. And we're making first positive steps to stop once and for all hunting in Israel. And hopefully we'll succeed with that, and species like turtle dove will benefit from that. And regarding habitat, we need to work more on restoration. So looking 20 years ahead, 30 years ahead, it's clear that what we have nowadays as habitats for birds will not be enough with climate change, with global biodiversity loss, with habitat loss in Israel and around us. We need to make some positive progress, and we need to work harder to restore habitats in Israel. And we're trying to do that wherever we can, but we still need to make better progress in that. And that's all. Thank you for listening. First of all, I hope that sooner rather than later the skies will open, and whoever of you that hasn't visited Israel, come and visit us in Israel. There are still plenty of beautiful things to see in Israel. Generally, for sure, the weather in Israel is better than the weather in Wales. It would be lovely if you stayed in touch. If any one of you is in social media, it's quite easy to find me on social media. And Steve certainly knows how to get in touch with me. Do keep in touch after this presentation. If you need any information, if you have any questions, I'm always happy to help.